Warm welcome to everyone present here today in this webinar. Honorable Chief Guest, Professor Larra Anderson, Dean Dr. Madhupa Bakshi, Principal Gaur Banerjee, and all the teachers and my lovely college mates. I, Audrija Shaha, welcome you all to this webinar. Today we have with us Professor Larra Anderson as our chief guest. It is an honor for me to welcome Professor Larra Anderson on behalf of the Heritage Academy. She would enlighten us today with her knowledge on the topic, how to construct the visual story structure. Professor Larra Anderson is a distinguished filmmaker and Pro-Vice-Chancellor at Norwich University of the Arts. Prior to joining NUA in December 2020, Professor Anderson worked as Dean of Screen at London College of Communication at the University of Arts, London, where she established and led the Screen School. Before her role at UAL, she was the director of the Northern Film School at Leeds Beckett University. Professor Anderson's film career has seen her produce, direct, and write material for film and television, as well as her primary work as a cinematographer. Her award-winning films have screened in cinemas internationally and at more than 65 festivals worldwide, with screenings at Sundance, Sheffield Docfest, Venice, SXSW, and BFI. Now I'd like to request Principal Gaur Banerjee to speak a few words and grace the event.
First of all, I would like to extend my heart to Team Media Science, including members of faculty and students, for organizing a webinar on how to construct the visual story structure as a part of the webinar series Media Sans Fontieres. The speaker of the webinar is Professor Larra Anderson, Pro Vice-Chancellor Academic, Norwich University of the Arts. Her most recent work in documentary feature film, House of Cardin, released in cinema, television, and streaming online, has been highly appreciated. Professor Larra, I know for certain students are eagerly waiting to listen to you. God bless you all. Jai Hind.
Thank you. I'm going to just take a moment to switch my screens. I'm going to do a presentation. Thank you, everyone, for coming today. This is a lecture that I have given before, but when I originally did it years ago, I did it for graduate students, for master's students. So I have updated it and done it for students who are coming at from a different point of view. And this is not just about cinematography. That's the other thing. This is something, when I first started these ideas, they were geared towards my cinematography students. And now over the years, I have come to think of this from a broader point of view. But I am going to bring a lot of cinematography ideas into it as well, because that is my background. So how to construct the visual story structure. I want to start with some ideas by an old teacher of mine from when I was in film school, Bruce Bloch. He is the Sir J. Eisenstein Endowed Chair in Cinematic Design at the University of Southern California School of Cinematic Arts, where I got my master's in fine art. And he has a book called The Visual Story, which I suggest to everyone, teachers and students who are interested in visual storytelling, to read if you have not had the opportunity yet. He breaks down the whole idea of the visual story into these elements. So space, line, shape, color, tone, and by tone we really mean kind of the tone of the color, and movement and rhythm, and says that these are the basic building blocks of the visual story in filmmaking. But the question comes up about, how do you know what space to represent? Where do you put the lines? What colors do you choose? How do you move the camera or the actors or the cars or whatever is in the shot? How do you pace or structure and edit to create a rhythm? Unfortunately, there is not time in this lecture for me to cover every aspect of filmmaking that these questions represent. But what I can speak to today is a method of thinking that will hopefully help you in making decisions as you go forward with your filmmaking discipline. So I'm going to start with cinematography, and I could tell you my opinion about where cinematographers start when they want to construct a visual story structure. But rather than you rely just on my word for it, I thought I would play you a clip from a film called Cinematographer Style, which interviewed dozens of cinematographers on just this topic. So I'm hoping that our internet connection will allow me to play this clip.
To take that narrative and translate it into imagery. Style of the picture and the look of the picture it starts with the written word. First you read the script, start with the story. It's always, always, always about the story. The script, obviously it starts with the script. The story, the material, the written word. It starts with the script. You've got to know the script. That's number one. You read the script and you try to figure out what this movie's going to look like. I mean, if I get a script, I really like to read it at least 10 times. When you first read a script, you have no idea the cast is, what the location is, what the sets are like, what the wardrobe is, but you have a vision, you come up with pictures.
Okay, so very clear instruction from these cinematographers who have, extensive credits in all different genres about how they start, and it all has to do with the script. So we start with the written word. Now, does this mean that we all have to be screenwriters? No, it does not. But do we have to all know screenwriting structure, terminology, and design? Well, it doesn't hurt to know some of the basics in order to speak with your director about the script. But even if you do learn a little about screenwriting, many don't agree on the structure anyway. And I'm going to show you some basic screenwriting structures. So here are the predominant structures referenced in Hollywood, at least. So this is by Sid Field. You can see that there's a 3-act structure, but then it's also divided into a first half and a second half. It's got multiple plot points, pinch points, a setup, confrontation, resolution, climax, and it starts with an inciting incident. So it's not, to me, as a non-screenwriter, it's not the most obvious structure. There's another structure by Robert McKee, and he actually has 2 diagrams that we use. This seems at first like a more simple version of how story structure might work. But then in concert with this, he also has this diagram, which is about the quest of the individual, of the protagonist. And this, for me, as a cinematographer, I don't find this helpful in terms of understanding what I need to do with a visual story. Linda Seeger has another setup where she talks about another 3 acts. But here you have many, many different building blocks. Some of you may have heard about the use of the Joseph Campbell's mythic structure and the hero's journey. And these are points around that some people use as a way of looking at the protagonist's journey throughout the film. Oh, goodness. Sorry, my screen's froze for a second there. Then you have some other diagrams. Again, this is about the hero's journey, but a different interpretation of it. Then even more, this has a 6-stage plot structure. I hope you see where I'm going with this, that there are no easy answers when it comes to screenwriting structure. This has 4 acts, which is a completely new way of looking at things. And then if you look at this, I don't really understand this structure, to be fair, and maybe my screenwriting colleagues understand it better than I do, but suffice it to say that people are continually coming up with new structures for how best to tell the screenwriting story. So what is the point of this. Why am I showing you these diagrams? I do think it's important that in order to speak with your filmmaking collaborators, you at least know terms like act, protagonist and antagonist, conflict, inciting incident, so that you're all speaking the same language. So for those of you who aren't interested in being screenwriters, you still need to listen very carefully to your screenwriting teachers, regardless of whether you want to be a screenwriter or not, because some basic things do need to be understood for sure. But I want to look at what it means in terms of story. And so I'm going to go back to these cinematographers one more time and just hear how they approach the story itself.
You read the script, and maybe you already have some ideas how it should look. But the basic thing is that you sit down with the director and start to talk about the movie. First, when I read a script, almost never have any ideas of images. I'm trying to just to read to see if I would like to see it as a story, you know. And also because I don't want to, maybe it's wrong, I don't know, but maybe I don't want to come to the meeting and meet the director and say, oh, I see very strong colors, and the director say, well, I see it black and white. So I guess for this reason, I just restrain myself to have any idea in the beginning, not only the first meeting, but also in the first weeks where I see my job like trying to be more like a sponge and to try to get any information I can get. I often don't really know. I have my ideas, and then, you know, I listen a lot, and I just walk through it and pretend I know. I don't have a clue. And because it sort of comes with, and I really do believe every film that I've done has sort of found its own style somehow. Basically, you have a great idea, or you have an idea what you want this picture, your picture to look like, or call yours because you're working on it. And then you talk with your director. It's usually you and the director who find a bond, who form a marriage, and that's what it's all about.
Break down the screenplay with the director, scene for scene, act by act.
Discuss things back and forth until we know it's sort of the right way to do it, and we'll bash it back and forth, and we'll keep landing on the same sort of thing. And I think that the photography falls into place, and then we're talking about, you know, how to shoot something, or what the mood is, or how important something is. I don't think the director and I discussed anything about the style of the film. The style kind of grew out of itself as we worked together.
There are cinematographers who are cinematographer painters, cinematographer engineers, cinematographer editors. I believe that I'm a bit of a cinematographer writer, in as much as I try to penetrate the story really well, and I try to find a way in which my lighting or my camera work becomes a character within the story.
Okay. So you can see that for these cinematographers, story is critical. That's where they get their ideas for how they actually shoot. It's not about finding a fancy camera or just starting with beautiful images. It starts with the script itself. We are talking about the construction of a visual story. So I'm putting up the very most basic script I possibly could. This is one of the things that are called a contentless dialogue scene, and it's generally used for actors and directors to start to workshop various ways that they can interact, because you can put a tremendous amount of information on top of this. So if this was our script, at this point, it doesn't tell us much. So we don't know, is it a comedy? Is it a drama? Is it a mystery dramedy? Who is the main character? Who are these people? Where are these people? When are they? We don't know, and we get to decide. So what are the decisions that we need to make in order to give content and character to this scene? Okay, so a lot of things need to be decided. This is not an exhaustive list, and this, I don't want to say that this is a definitive list. This is my list, and I am right about some things, and I'm sure that I'm missing some things as well, and that my esteemed filmmaking colleagues can point to things that I perhaps have not included. But Just from this list itself, there are an incredible amount of things that need to be decided. And when I am functioning as a cinematographer, these are all things that I need to consider. And I'll show you why. And these are the things that get translated into the moments of visual storytelling. So I'm just going to remind you for a moment what those things are. And each of these concepts need to be related back to these concepts in order to create a visual story. So let's just look at one for a moment. So if I'm applying space, line, shape, color, tone, movement, and rhythm to setting, how do I go about doing that? Okay, here's a setting. I used to do this exercise with my beginning cinematography students. I would say, we're gonna start a story, and everyone starts a story in their own head. So you can do this along with me if you so choose. So first question is, where in the universe are we? Let's assume we're on Earth, but obviously it doesn't have to be. So if we're on Earth, where on Earth? I would say, let's choose our own city for the purpose of this exercise. So where in my city? So let's say it's in my house, and where in my house? In my room. So that's what this picture represents. So now there's still questions to be asked. So when are we? As in what year? What time of year is it? Is it spring, summer, autumn, or winter? What day of the week is it? That can make a difference because of the activities that are going on outside. What time of day is it? So I'm going to suggest that this is a Sunday morning and that it's dawn. And I'm going to ask you in your mind to walk in that door and choose for yourself which window the sun is coming in. And then think about what is the color of the light and what is the quality of the light. And by quality, I mean the tone and the softness or hardness of that light. Now this is where things get interesting in terms of visual storytelling. This was a revelation for me when I first moved to England from the United States, was that I had my pre-assumptions about what morning light looked like at dawn. My students were from all over the world. And so I said, what color is the light? And my first student said, gray and diffuse and soft. Now in England, that is correct. But in Los Angeles, light is bright and pink in the winter and bright and hard and white in the summer. And I bet where you are, it's different than that. It could be yellow or red or blue or green even, depending on the season, depending on the location. And so just the color and the tone or quality of the light can tell us an immense amount about the story and the setting with just a few decisions. So these things are key. And that's just one set of decisions that comes from story. So you can see how you can go from the context that's written in the script and the decisions that the screenwriter has made, and in conversation with the director or as the director, interpret those into the beginnings of a visual story. So from there, and I want to say from there to those students who want to be cinematographers, you do not decide on these things until after you have decided how you want to express your story. So the camera movement, the framing, the focus, what kind of lights you use, none of these things are relevant questions until after all of the analysis of the visual story through the script and through an understanding of the elements of story are interpreted through those visual elements as best defined by Bruce Bloch You may find that you have others that you want to include or eliminate from that list, but I will say that Professor Block has spent a lifetime studying films, and I think he's got a pretty good understanding of what those elements are. So I'm going to look at some images, some still images, and we're going to analyze them a little bit together in light of this. So these images are all from the writer-director Wes Anderson, from several of his films. This is the Fantastic Mr. Fox. It's a stop motion animation, and I think it's really interesting because this is animation. It's not even reality, and it's utilizing exactly the same principles. Now you look at this color palette, and it is a very unified color palette. Those colors go together. They're not in contrast with each other. And just from that color palette, there is a piece that is told. You can tell that this moment in the story is one of peace, just by the color palette itself. From my perspective as well, I know location. This is my perspective. This says to me that this yellow color of the light says that it's very late afternoon in the autumn in the Western United States. Now that may say something completely different to you, but I think it's very important to understand that those choices tell specific stories to very different people, and therefore one needs to be aware of that. So here's another shot from a short film that he's done. Here the interesting thing is that there is no directionality to the light. It's very soft light. It's very difficult to determine, other than by this tree down here, what time of year it is. And it's very difficult to determine whether this is morning or afternoon. But one of the things I find really interesting about this shot is that they've pulled these colors, the orange in the windows and the greens in the rooftop, into the actual clothing of the characters, and have made the characters connected to their environment, connected to the city in which they're standing. And that's a very conscious choice. Here's another, and this character in this story is trapped. This is a part of the story where we are seeing her trapped in her environment, and that is literally what is happening in this scene. The lines create lines of prison. The lines contain her from her foot to her head, it's a series of blocks. This gets even more extreme in another shot of her, where she has contrasting colors, and she's behind a bar, and there are bars all around her, and there's strong tones and bright tones indicating danger signals. You know, that orange is a sign of danger. And, you know, we don't need words, and we don't need to know what's come before or after this shot to understand the conflict that's going on for this character in this shot. Now, here's another moment in the scene with the same character, and note how different this is just from the visual story. It's very soft and muted tones. It is unified. The tones are unified with the background, especially of that young man that she's looking at the map with. And then look at the focus. It's soft focus in the background. It's making this come off on two very separate planes, and it's telling a story about a much more unified and free individual at this point in the film. Very small, basic choices, but that choice of that soft focus, that can only be achieved through which lens you choose and the distance you place that lens from those subjects. So this is a very conscious choice that the cinematographer and the director have made in their visual storytelling. So this is the last photo I'm going to show from this, and I know we want to make time for questions as well, but this is from another one of his films, and I think it's an interesting shot to end on because it raises a lot of questions. You've got these contrasting colors, but they're all in this tone, these softer tones. You have lots of lines that are in conflict, but then you have two characters who are very much engaged. And so there's this question, is this a comedy or is this a drama? Are these characters unified or are they in conflict? Who is the antagonist and who is the protagonist, and where the heck are we? I mean, that is completely a question. And we can't answer all those questions from one shot. And this is where the other visual qualities come in, of movement through cinematography and the blocking of actors to guide the eye, and picture and sound editing to design the rhythm of the images, and the attention, because although we're talking about visual stories, sound does guide the eye as well. If you hear a sound off screen, you turn to look at where it's coming from. So all those things come together to create the visual design of the film and the visual story structure. So that's a beginning. Those are ideas I just want you to begin to consider and to really understand the importance of the written word and how to begin to consider how to turn that written word into visual imagery. So that is it. Thank you so much. I'm gonna turn off sharing my screen for the moment. Okay, I am back if there are any questions.
Okay, Laura, that was fantastic. It was short and brief. And it was, I know the filmmaking, it's not easy to, compress everything in a one lecture or two, but you try to actually, summarize it, at least how to look at those pictures. So that is a great beginning. That's what I would say. And I do not have questions at the moment here in the chat, but for my students, I would say, okay, first of all, I would like to thank you a lot. I mean, you agreed to do this webinar, and I know when I was your student, we were all excited, for every lecture of yours, and especially everybody, wanted to know how cinema works, how camera works, and where to put the camera, how to block those scenes, and it was great experience for. And in that context, I would ask now, because here, when I'm teaching my students, you talked about, there is the lights, lenses, and all this is not relevant until and unless you have your story in place. So I would like you to, elaborate more on that, because every time, whenever, I ask my student to pitch their ideas or something, they would start with, okay, so first shot is we are, the camera zooms in, and then we see a close-up of a guy, and then it tilts out and it moves away. That is how actually most of the students see their story. But how important, I mean, you said it is, it's much later that stage comes in, but when you are starting your idea, so what do you, how do you work with the director if you are a cinematographer and you are collaborating on a project and it's a really shoestring budget, small project? And how do you collaborate with the director with that idea? And how do you form an idea to pitch for, any project?
Okay. Well, the first thing I will say is that I always look at film as there's, it's just like reading, writing, and speaking in terms of language. Film is a language. The differences between reading, writing, and speaking, in my opinion, is that we first learn to speak, and then we learn to read, and then we learn to write. With film, we learn to read first. We look at images, and then we think that we know how to speak about images. And then the most difficult thing is learning, like with language, is learning how to write the images. But very often I find that with, I think students come to film school because they want to know how to write, but they don't realize that speaking is not writing. So they feel competent because they think they know how to read a film. And then they think that they know how to speak the language of the film. And then they think that writing it is just applying equipment to the speaking of the film. But it is absolutely not. It's missing a huge step. So when people pitch films based on, it's going to start with a close-up of, someone's left eye, and then it's going to pull out, and it's going to show that they're looking at this grand accident with cars piled up everywhere and smoke and fire. That's speaking about what you see, but that's not writing the film. That's not making the film. And those aren't the ideas that create the lived experience that is a film. I mean, I talk to my students about the fact that, this is a time-based art, and we are essentially creating memories for people, lived memories. They live through these stories. And so that's, human beings have a drive towards narrative. They have a drive towards stories. Real life does not start with a beginning, middle, and end. We have moments where it feels like a beginning, but our, time is not divided that way. Time is hopefully, perhaps, maybe eternal. We don't know that. But, we divide that up in order to feel like we can control things. We divide things into stories. Films have beginnings, middles, and ends. That's essentially what a story is. And you need to be able to get those points across in a manageable way in order to engage an audience, because the audience wants a story. A roller coaster ride of images, but a roller coaster ride of images does not tell a story. And so that's what you need to pitch. You need to pitch the story. And if you're in a group of students, especially, who are making a film, and you're standing up in front of a group of instructors, and you want them to give you permission to make your film, or to make that particular film, you should choose the person who tells the story the best. Definitely not the cinematographer with their whizzy ideas of how they're going to move the camera around. Maybe the screenwriter, maybe the director. Sometimes the director's too involved with the cinematographer and those whizzy ideas. Often the producer, the person who's inspired by the whole concept. The best salesperson, the best storyteller is the person to pitch the film. And because that's what the audience wants. They want the story. And, no amount of visual whizziness is going to satisfy them. Oh, we're frozen for a moment. I don't know if you can still hear me.
Can you hear me?
I can hear you now. There we go.
Yeah. So there is this one question from my student. His name is Rohit Karmakar. He says, do we need to select color palette while writing the script? And how does it affect the mood of a particular scene?
Yeah, absolutely. You should not select the visuals when you're writing the script. One of the reasons for this is that you want to, as a screenwriter, being a screenwriter is very much like being an architect. You are putting out the plans for the building, and you're making sure that it's a solid building that has a purpose and a point, and you're thinking about those purposes and those points and how things hold together. But then you want to work with collaborators who know their disciplines better than you do. So for me, I'm a cinematographer. I collaborate with a production designer who understands color palettes much better than I do, and has much more control over the color palette than I do with just the lighting. But obviously the lighting and the production design need to be joined up. And it is very much the case that very often cinematographers will get credit for making beautiful images that really are just them photographing some beautiful design by the production designer. So that's the person you want to make your best friend if you're a cinematographer. But the visual story should not be in the script. Because that needs to be worked. That's a play of things that happens on the set. Once you get the actors involved, once you've cast people, once you start looking at locations, once, you know, it's a visual exercise. And that's not to say that someone can't write a script and then direct it. And if they have the ability, you know, like a very few filmmakers do, but there are those like Steven Soderbergh who writes and then directs and shoots and edits, and in some cases does sound on his own films. And Robert Rodriguez does a lot of that himself. He even does the music, I believe. You know, so it's not to say that you can't do that, but you have to switch your head every time you do one of those roles.
Great. One more question I would ask about, you know, characters. Yeah. Here, there are some stories which are, you know, where the characters is quite strong. And there are some stories which are just the like very poetic films where character is not that important.
Yeah.
So many cinematographers actually they're drawn to, you know, shoot the poetic films because there they have a lot more you know scope to show their skill. And the character driven films where actually director or screenwriter they are into those kind of films. So how does, I mean, I'm asking this question on behalf of all the aspiring cinematographers.
Yeah.
So how do they, you know, try to tie them, you know, find the middle of it? So how do they adjust? Yeah.
I don't know if you remember the cinematographer Phil Robertson, who did a workshop. He's a Scottish cinematographer who did some workshops with us when we were at the Northern Film School together. In any case, Phil has done everything from independent features to Hollywood features and television as well. And his wife said this great thing that Phil and I both nodded our heads and said, yes, that's absolutely right. And it's what she always tells him. She says, it's better to do a bad job on a good film than a good job on a bad film. Because the thing is that your film's gonna get seen if it's a good film. And people want story. Now, that's not to say that they don't want beauty, because we certainly want beauty as well. But if you can apply your beautiful skills of storytelling to a good story, that's the best way of going.
Great. Thank you. There is another question. How does the story structure of films differ from web series, OTT platform projects?
Yeah. Okay. Well, the story structure in terms of the visual story is no different. In terms of the actual serial nature of the story, I always like to think that, you know, your 1.5 to 3 hour long feature films are actually short stories. They are, if you were to just, you know, the best feature films that are adaptations from stories come from short stories because, you know, there's not all of the intricate web of characters. Whereas you think of something like, you know, I remember the Game of Thrones books. If you look at them, they're about this thick each, and there were like 6 of them. I don't know how many. And so that series had to go on and on and on and on and on. And so television or web series, anything that's in a series, episodic series, are like novels, you know. And so the structure of the stories is different. That's why with television series, very often they have what's called a Bible. In Hollywood, they call it a series Bible. And that's all the rules and the context and the world that this story is going to be told in, and then the stories flow out of that world. Whereas you don't need that for a feature film in the same way, because it's so much more contained around the actions of the primary characters.
There is one more question from a student. What is the relation between the color palette and the sound of a particular scene? Is there any?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question, actually. I mean, I would think that if a director was making a director and a sound designer decided, because they will make that decision probably after, in terms of the final execution, they will make that decision after the production designer has designed what's shot on set. But I would think that if you made a contrast between those two, it would be making a pretty strong statement in terms of the story about what contrast meant. So you do have to, there are no hard and fast rules. It's just being aware of when you do make a choice, what that choice means to an audience member.
Great. How much time we have? 5.
We have another 10 minutes.
Okay. Okay. Lara, do you have 10 minutes more?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, great. There is always, you know, in the literature and and the films, there is a one line which we always keep, you know, telling each other while, you know, making any great project, and that is show, don't tell.
Yeah.
So can you talk about that? Like, because I have seen many students when they write a script, so their dialogues are so big and, you know, they don't finish. And then everything they want to describe in the dialogues, in the lines. And I keep, you know, saying, you know, we cut it down, but they find it difficult. How do we, you know, cut that scene? So yeah, please comment on that, please.
Yeah, I think that's why, I think we started with silent films when you were in film school. I know that they started me in silent films. The first 5 films I made were, 6 films I made were silent films, no dialogue. You made a soundtrack, but you weren't allowed to do any dialogue. And that really focuses the mind on the visual storytelling completely. And it allows you to understand how that, back to what editors are able to do with rhythm and movement, how, you know, the Kuleshov effect, how juxtaposing certain shots next to each other change the meaning of those shots. And that's the thing, again, about the reading, writing, and speaking of film. I think it's I think that the tendency to overwrite dialogue comes from the speaking of film, the reading and the speaking, because you're only aware of that dialogue and maybe some big explosions. You know, so those are the things that you're reading. So when you first attempt to make a film, you just are speaking it. You're speaking all the dialogue as if you're the actor. You're speaking all the action. You know, you haven't gotten yet to the point of writing. And the writing is where you start dealing with visual language and visual storytelling and auditory. But those two things, you know, those two things are really wound up together with each other. And when I mean auditory, I don't mean dialogue. I mean sound design and music. Yeah.
Yeah, I remember, you know, making my first introductory film there, and it didn't have dialogue. It has just the language, pa 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 pa. And there, actually, I could actually, while making it, I could understand how difficult it is to explain the scene without words.
Yeah.
Yeah. So then I would. There is another question, why, when we talk about some cinema grammar, the rules, some of the students, they have a habit of, why do I have to, you know, follow those composition rules, leading lines, shallow depth? framing, contrast. Why do I need to do that? I am doing something experimental, and that's what I want to do. I mean, because it's very different film. I'm making something unique. So,
Yeah.
do you, yeah, do you find that
I'm laughing.
there in you?
Yeah. I'm laughing because I was that student. I I went to a Hollywood film school where people were trying to teach me Hollywood conventions, and I was convinced that it did not have any application to my filmmaking practice. And then we had a film analysis teacher who analyzed everything and just basically showed you story structure, you know, and that even the loosest, most experimental things still had a structure. And even, I mean, even if you look at, oh gosh, I'm blanking on his name. The film is Moth. Oh, this is horrible. It'll come to Stan Brakhage. Even if you look at something that is just pure experimental film, you still, when you're watching it, you still search for the beginning, middle, and the end. You still do. You still go, oh, I'm in the middle. Wait, am I getting close to the end? Is there a meaning? Is there a reason that D came after B? You know, and you do naturally do those kind of things. And if you understand that, you are going to be playing with that dynamic. So you're either going to buy into it, or you're going to make your audience do it themselves without supplying that to them, but you're still creating an experience for people who want a narrative, and there's going to be that play back and forth between it. You need to be aware of what your audience is reading, and know that they have certain expectations about what that is, and play with it or play against it. You're making a choice. It's not all about you. And that's a hard thing to learn.
Larra, can I have a
Thank you.
question?
Yes, please.
Okay. When you look at films here and films in Britain, the treatments are different, right?
Yeah.
What happens when a student goes from here? Maybe Professor Shinde went from here. What happens when a student goes from here? Do they face problems because it's a different culture, it's a different genre?
I would think that Rajesh could probably answer that question better than I could. I mean, I come at it from the outside of looking at students from all over the world who come, you know, very much so all over the world. You know, in my last film school, I believe 27% of our students were overseas students. Okay. So about a third. Yeah, people express their stories through different means, but I do believe that fundamentally story is a human drive. You know, when I read something like, you know, the first novels, you know, first novel coming out of, I believe it was out of Japan, The Tale of Genji, you know, it still is, engages me like a novel. Tolstoy engages me like a novel, you know. Granted, there are different film traditions, and some are identified more as being Western than others, or more Eastern than others. But if your film's I could be wrong, but my impression is that if your film is an hour and a half to 3 hours long, it's still going to have some of the same arc and the same conflicts in it for antagonists and protagonists. And that if it's a series, it's going to continue through multiple episodes. You know, you look at something, I think that we engage in, personally, I think we engage in storytelling because our own lives have beginning, middles, and ends. Our own romances have beginnings, middles, and ends. You know, the things that the things that we care about come and go. And so that's the stories that we hold on to.
And what would your advice be to the students who are aspiring to go abroad?
To go abroad, again, Rajesh probably has insights that I don't share and that would probably be really interesting to hear. I think that I went abroad when I was 15. I went to school overseas. In my case, I went to Italy, and I was dealing with school in another language and being on my own for the first time. And there is a culture shock. But having gone through a culture shock, and then a culture shock again when I went back home, you know, you adjust and then you come back home and it all seems so strange. It makes you a citizen of the world. Once you understand what that means to be in another culture, that everything isn't like what it seems like at home, that the values do change, that people do interact differently, it makes you a better storyteller. I mean, I do say that to students who are able to go to institutions where there are a lot of international students, or at least students, you know, in the larger countries, students from all over the country, that if you really want to be a storyteller that tells stories that affect people around the world, it's one of the best ways of learning how to do that. You know, if you want to tell stories to your friends and family and tell very local stories, that's a ambition, and many great filmmakers have done that. If you have the ambition to do something more global, then that global education and getting it, you need to get out of your own town, village, or city. Yeah.
I myself went to California State University, so I know.
Okay. Yeah.
There's a question, I think, Rajesh, you might want to take that last question. You're on mute, Rajesh. Rajesh, you're on mute.
Yeah. Yes. Thank you, ma'am. There is a question. Should one overpower colors to exaggerate emotions of the characters? Should one overpower colors to exaggerate emotions of the characters?
I'm guessing that the question referred to was is there any difference between the grammar of cinematography in Hollywood and other regions, or is that?
I guess he's asking, should we, the colors, the power of colors for exaggerating emotions of the character, if I'm correct. I do not know what does it mean. But is there a possibility? Yes, ma'am.
Niloy is there. Why don't you ask Niloy to talk?
Nilay, would you like to elaborate your question? Would you like to explain what you said? Nilay, are you there? Okay. Shall I go to the next question then?
Go ahead.
Is there any difference between the grammar of cinematography in Hollywood and other regions?
What do you think?
What do you think, Rohit? I'll go to the question, next question. What's the best way to establish conflict in storytelling? Is it through visual motifs and tone of the film, or through appealing dialogues?
Well, I wouldn't say dialogues. I would say acting, because dialogue, because what we're talking about is what actually appears on screen and is heard. So, conflict is established in the script and then interpreted through visual storytelling and through sound and through performance. So, I think if it's evident in the script, It needs to be interpreted through all of those things simultaneously to get the point across. Unless there's a juxtaposition, unless you want to show that two characters are having a fight in the middle of a peaceful field because they aren't in touch with their own environment. But that's a story point.
Okay. There's another question. Can I ask? There is one question somebody asked on, Saptarshi asked on WhatsApp. Do cinematographers keep an editing mindset while shooting something for his own purpose or for freelancing? What do you mean?
Yeah, I think that cinematographers need to learn editing, period. I think if you don't know how shots are going to be cut together or can cut together, it makes you a much poorer cinematographer. I am not a good editor, but I do know how to edit. No one would ever hire me to edit their film, but I can advise on editing. I know when shots go together well. I know what I need to do as a cinematographer in terms of going from a wide shot to moving the camera at an angle to go into a closer shot. You know, I know what's going to happen if I put two shots together, and are they going to jump or not? Those kind of things. Yeah, you need to know those things.
Actually, with respect to this answer, I have another question, because many students, when they know operating software, editing software, does that make them an editor? Or if somebody knows how to operate the camera, does that make them DOP? Because that's what people think many times.
Knowing how to operate a camera makes you a camera operator, or even it makes you a first camera assistant, because I actually don't usually touch a camera anymore, because you can't think about the camera all the time and be looking and thinking about the artistry. And the job of a cinematographer is to be the director and to collaborate with the director and the production designer. And you can't have those conversations, and you can't tell your gaffer and your key grip what to do. And you can't do any of that if you're trying to figure out how to set up a camera. So, and the last film I did, but the film I did before that, I had 4 cameras going at once. So obviously I can't be behind a camera. So, yeah.
Larra, I'm sorry we have gone beyond the time which we have decided. But we are obviously we are very happy to have you here.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Larra. And thank you, Professor Shinde, for organizing this and bringing her on. We hope we maintain the connect.
Absolutely.
And yes, and we can do together. Best would be if we can create some experiences for both students, for both the students on that side and this side also. It would be and thank you, Professor Shinde, for doing putting us all together, connecting us.
Yeah, thank you so much. It's been a real pleasure, and it's an honor to be asked. So thank you for having me.